everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are returning to one of our favoriteest series in fantasy. We are talking about the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Now, within the First Law Trilogy, we have been doing these character profiles, which have been so much fun, by the way. This is a chance for us to get deep into a specific character throughout their arc across the entire First Law Trilogy. We've done Baez, we've done Logan Ninefingers, Sanden Galacta, the Dogman. We have done the Dogman, people. And now we are going to yet another POV character, Jezal.
Yeah. This is going to be a really exciting one to get into, Charles. I think Jezal doesn't always get his due as, I think he's an underrated character because a lot of people find him very unlikable, and I would put myself in that category too of, I think he's a really interesting character that Joe Abercrombie has written, and I enjoy reading about him, but and we'll get into this with more nuance later, but definitely, at least at first, he comes off extremely unlikable and narcissistic and things like that. So people aren't always as passionate about Jezal as a character as maybe some of these other characters who are more likable than Jezal. So anyway, before we get too much into it, I do want to give my spoiler warning, which is that we'll be getting into the entirety of the First Law Trilogy, the original trilogy, like Charles mentioned, which takes us through Last Argument of Kings. So if you haven't read The Blade Itself, Before They're Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings, all by Joe Abercrombie, then now is a good time to turn this down in your headphones, because we will not be holding back anything from that original trilogy. We won't go beyond that in terms of spoilers, though, so you're safe if you've read through Last Argument of Kings.
Very well said, sir. And we were working on a tagline for the Jezal character profile episode. We've come up with Taking It on the Chin, and I also have a B title that I wanted to float by you, which is No Choice at All. And the only reason I'm leaning away from that one was because that was always Logan's thing and would never reference Jezal, but I feel like it mirrors Jezal's arc really well. And I would argue that Jezal...
When I think Jezal, I think of mirrors.
Right. And I think Jezal mirrors Logan in a lot of ways, and this is kind of how I want to frame our whole conversation as we go through Jezal's story. Is he's almost like the opposite of Logan, where Logan's a really likable guy, but when you study his character, there's some concerning things about him. And Jezal's kind of the reverse. He's a really unlikable guy, but when you look, take a deeper look into his character arc, there's actually some redeeming qualities about him. And that's what I want to kind of look at today. And I also want to look at how Abercrombie uses Jezal to subvert this idea of character growth in fantasy.
I think you nailed some great discussion topics there, Charles. I'm very excited to get into this because I think we're on a similar page to how we're conceptualizing Jezal as a character.
Right.
And we also haven't really gotten the chance to dive deep into fleshing out the details of all of that. So I think this is, I don't know, I'm actually more excited than before now that I'm hearing the way you're thinking about this, because I think there's a lot to say. So
absolutely.
All right. Yeah.
Well, let's just get going
let's
right
do it.
away with the Blade itself, which opens, I believe. Well, it might open with Logan, but then it quickly cuts to Jezal gambling with his friends and just reveling in taking their money. He recognizes that some of them aren't as rich as others and might need the money more, but he just gets a big kick out of taking their money anyway because he's smarter than them or better at cards than them or whatever. So that's how we get open to Jezal, and this is why I think he didn't do as well on our polls as the Dogman did. People tend to like, Jezal least, and these are valid reasons why he's an unlikable guy. Right off the bat, we get full on hit with the fact that he is just reveling and taking money from his friends.
Right. And I think this will come up a lot, that Jezal is a jerk at the start. He is narcissistic. He's a jerk. He's all these things we don't like about him at the start of the First Law Trilogy. And people's reactions to thinking, what, this guy's a jerk, aren't we? So, like, this is our young male protagonist type. Shouldn't he be, and he's noble and all these things, like, and by that we don't mean noble in the sense of a characteristic of a character that shows virtues. We mean it literally. He's a noble in the sense of he's higher up in the way this society works, and he is just being unnecessarily mean, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, to people who he sort of thinks of as his friends and think of him as their friends. And of course, the way that people start reacting to Jezal when he's just trying to take advantage of people who have less than him is that, like, this guy is ridiculously privileged and he needs to stop is kind of our reaction. And I think this sets us up in a lot of ways where in a typical fantasy story, which is not usually what we get from Lord Grimdark Joe Abercrombie, we are at least thinking, okay, this guy's a jerk, he's privileged, he's all these things. So we would feel, if this was a Brandon Sanderson book, which, like, we love Brandon Sanderson's work. We've been very, excited to talk about him recently. We did our Where to Start with Brandon Sanderson episode recently too. But Brandon Sanderson might be making you a promise here with a character like Jezal that this guy might start as a jerk and privileged, but I'm going to take him through a series of events that is going to help him check that privilege and start to become a better person. That's what we are expecting in a lot of fantasy stories. And I think that would be a reasonable thing when you are reading your first ever Joe Abercrombie book in The Blade itself, to think that's the arc that we're setting up for a character like Jezal. And he's already setting us up for disappointment, where we know, this is spoilers all the way through. We know that Jezal's not going to quite fulfill that arc in the way that, Brandon Sanderson might write it if he was writing a character like that, and people can feel let down by that.
Yeah, Abercrombie's definitely laying the foundation for Jezal's character arc with these character tropes that we all recognize of a, privileged, an unsensitive, kind of brazen character. And we are just not ready for where this is going to go. But he starts off unlikable and he earns it really well. And it's so interesting to see how instead of that, I'm good now ending, we get it's like, I'm kind of good now, but it doesn't really matter, which is so beautiful. And we're going to get into that. But first, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, we'll get into it when we get into it.
We'll get into it, but first we gotta be training for the contest, right? And this is another thing where we get more insight into Jezal's vanity, where he's only doing this to gain fame and prestige, and his father kind of wants him to do it. He wants to be better than his brothers, which is another thing. Just the idea of competing in the contest makes him better than his brothers, who he's constantly in this status rivalry with. So it's fun to hear him and his reasons for doing things. They're incredibly superficial, and they just help build on this foundation of Jezal being this unlikable arrogant, ignorant guy. So that's all well and good until we meet Artie.
Can I say one more thing about the
Of
training for
course.
the contest before we get into Jezal's relationship with Artie, which
Of course.
is, I think his ability and the way he treats that natural ability in a lot of ways reflects his place in society here, where Jezal is presented as ridiculously naturally talented at his swordplay. He's got everything anyone could ever ask for in terms of his gifts, which he did nothing to earn.
Yes.
Much like how he's in a place in society where he did nothing to earn being a noble, though he, if you ask Jezal, he thinks, I don't know if he would even really understand the question. Like, yeah, of course I deserve it. I am it.
Yeah.
So I think that, and you get these places where it's bounced off of a character like West, who will basically say straight up to Jezal, like, if I had your talent, I imagine what I could have accomplished. I already won a contest, but like you, Jezal, if I had what you had, I would be like the best swordsman. He didn't say it in this way, but he'd be like the best swordsman.
Yeah,
that's
true. Because Wes, paralleling him against Wes, it was so brilliant because Wes is the guy who pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and rose to basically as high as his social status will allow him to go, and in some cases even higher than that. So then you have him training with Jezal, who, like you said, has so many natural gifts. He's handsome, he's rich, he's got like this athletic prowess even without even having to try that hard. And he's just kind of coasting through and doing things because out of like family obligations or sibling rivalries. And that gets rubbed up against Wes, who watches him and is like so much wasted potential in this like spoiled brat, basically.
Well said, Charles.
And I mean, that continues when he meets Artie and becomes smitten with Artie. And there's so many incredible lines in here from the narration about Jezal's interactions with Artie and comments about her being low birth and related to Wes and all these other things. But he can't help himself. There's something about Artie that just keeps pulling him in.
Yeah, and Charles, I don't know if your plan is to like take us in a more detailed way through the arc with Artie and the blade itself, but if we are, I see it in the notes you wrote here, you want to talk about this why does Jezal love Artie question. I feel and I have a quote that I feel like can pretty much I mean, it's all subjective and all that, but we'll do as good a job of addressing this question directly as anything else I could find in the text. So let me get this up.
Got it. So, I'll just say that this is a question that I do want to track throughout the series as we go through Jezal's plot of like, why does Jezal love Artie? And to me, that's a very interesting question. And I think it highlights what Jezal didn't realize about himself, because Artie's like talking circles around him. There's wordplay, and he becomes interested in her intelligence and her self-confidence and the fact that she's not fazed by his nobility status. It kind of throws him off, but also makes him feel like there's actually some kind of genuine connection being made because those things like social status are thrown out the window. So that just kind of, and there's so many moments where Jezal thinks back on Artie's intelligence, and I don't know, I just think this idea of Jezal realizing there's like genuine human connection out there that I want to track throughout the series.
For sure, Charles, and I think you're touching on all the kind of things that I expect this quote will help drive home, which is reflecting on his feelings for Artie. Why did he feel like this? Why did he couldn't even bring himself to think the word like her so much? Then it came to him. He knew why. She didn't like him. Those mocking half smiles, those sidelong glances he caught sometimes, those jokes that went just a little too close to the bone, not to mention the occasional examples of outright scorn. She liked his money Maybe. She liked his position in the world, of course. She liked his looks, undoubtedly, but in essence, the woman despised him. And he'd never had that feeling before. He had always just assumed that everybody loved him, had never really had cause to doubt he was a fine man worthy of the highest respect. But Artie didn't like him. He saw it now, and that made him think. Apart from the jaw, of course, the jaw, which we know where that will
on
go.
the chin, that's right.
Apart from the jaw, of course, and the money and the clothes, what was there to like? She treated him with the contempt he knew he deserved, and he couldn't get enough of it. Strangest thing, Jezal mumbled to himself, slouching miserably against the wall of the tunnel. Strangest thing. It made him want to change her mind. And I think that's it. Like, Jezal is not known for his self-awareness, but I think this moment is the exception that makes the rule. Is he's actually just reflecting on his lack of self-awareness here, where it's like Artie treats him like the person that if he really were to stop and think and weigh the evidence, because he's not incapable of that. Sure, he's not as clever as someone like Lakta. And he's not, he can't scheme like someone like Bias or anything like that. But that being said, he's got some capability for thinking if he puts his mind to it. It's just that he's never been forced to put his mind to actually reflecting on what might be not great about him, because no one in the world has ever treated him like he's anything less than amazing. So, you're going through life being treated that way. Why would you stop and think, wait, what's wrong with me? You've never had to.
Exactly.
And this is the first time for Jezal. This is but because he has some capability for like assessing things, he also, I think, has this nagging feeling underneath that, like, there is something wrong that makes him not a great person. And Artie is bringing that to the surface by being the first person to ever really just tell him these things. And that makes her, Artie, since the first time I read the First Law series, has been like one of my favorite characters, actually. And I don't talk about her as much because there's less attention paid to her and all these kind of things, which is, part of her character, that she's starved for that attention. So the fan base reflects that, I think, in some ways. And the way I don't give her the attention as a character that she deserves is also reflected by that. But it's like a person who has nothing to lose already is so much like lower than Jezal that she doesn't aspire to say anything but the truth to him, is the only lower in the society, of course, and she's the only person who's ever told him the truth about himself, and he knows he needs that, and that's, I think, why he feels like he needs Artie.
That is, a brilliant quote. I think you nailed the answer to this question, honestly. It's exactly that. And this is what I love about Jezal's character, because Abercrombie has such nuanced, layers to his character, because on the surface level, yeah, he's a not likable guy. But Abercrombie brilliant weaves in a lot of his narcissism is the direct result of being systemic in this society. He was born into it and pampered his whole life. There's something wrong with the society of the Union where nobles have they all think like Jezal does. We were born into nobility. People have always told us we were great. Even though we aren't necessarily contributing anything, we think we deserve this. And that's what every noble in the Union is like, and that's actually the problem that the Union is facing. There's all these other societies that are mobilizing faster than them because they're just content, they're stagnant, and Jezal was raised in that. So yes, he's not likable, but you start to feel like there might be something to like some cracks in that because he's realizing how systemic it was. He's like, man, like everyone's told me how awesome I am. I've always been awesome. I never stopped to consider that maybe I didn't earn that much of this, like is this idea of like what is there to me as an individual beyond what I was born into. And it's not until Jezal meets Artie that he even considers something like that. And it's because of his desire to prove himself to Artie that he finds new inspiration to compete in the contest, and he changes the way he trains. Yeah, it's because he wants to prove Artie wrong, but I also think there's a more subtle layer to that. He wants to prove for himself that there's more than just there's more to him than his clothes and money and looks.
Yeah, I think that he wants to prove Artie wrong, and I think he also wants to prove Artie right in the sense that she's still investing her time in him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Artie has some sort of sense that there is some good underneath all of this with when it comes to Jezal. And I think that so this comes up at one point when Artie, there's that big moment where Artie and West get into a fight, and he's like, West does really reprehensible things and hits her and all that, and West is pissed about Artie spending time with Jezal,
Right.
And she, yes, in part as a way to hurt West, but I think there's truth underlying this statement she says, which is, she ends it with, perhaps I'll go and pay a call on Jezal. He may be the shallowest idiot in the whole city, but I don't think he'd ever raise a hand to me. Do you? And
such a great line.
Yeah.
I love that scene so much.
Yeah, it's a harrowing scene, but
yes.
it's one of the most well-written scenes in the entire series, in my opinion.
Me too.
And this moment is kind of like, this is Jezal. You look at him, and you see so many things that there are to not like about him. You see how conceited he is. You see that he's, he barely looks past himself ever. He's maybe shallow. But all that said, like, he wouldn't, of course he would never hit Artie. Like, do we think he ever really would? Like, I don't. And
no.
I think that it's like, that's with all of these incredibly violent characters in the First Law world and these people who do really messed up things, like we talked about Logan, like, I don't put anything past Logan at this point, basically. Right? Like,
right.
Any act of violence or messed up thing, like, yeah, sure, he'll, like, Logan, 99% of the time, you'd be like, this guy's awesome. Like, what a nice guy. He's got all these great witticisms. And that 1% of the time, it's like, what did this guy just do? That is the most messed up thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And Jezal, 99% of the time, you're like, geez, I cannot deal with this guy. But he doesn't have that 1% of the time where he's, like, unnecessarily being violent with a woman he cares about or something like that. And he just wouldn't, because he doesn't have that, like, bad bone really in his body. He just hasn't had the opportunity to reflect on himself and grow until, I think, we get into before they are hanged.
Well,
Is that okay to
I think that's fair, but I mean, we're skipping a couple things about the contest, and I just wanted to react to that really quickly because it's so true. With Jezal, though, getting back to this, like, a lot of the negative things about his character are almost like a result, are like almost systematic in the way that they've come about, because it's the society he was born in. He's acting like everyone else around him. Like, there's the scene where he's defending, he's drinking before the finals with his friends, and one of his drinking buddies is like, oh, that Artie, though, isn't she like kind of cute? And then, he says more lewd things than that. But Jezal gets mad and starts fighting him, and everyone's like, what are you talking about? It's just someone who's like a lower social status than us. Why are you getting so worked up? And Jezal's almost kind of embarrassed that he's kind of admitting his feelings for someone that's not, in the courtship and doesn't look like
Yeah.
someone a noble lady's supposed to look like and all these other things. But Jezal's like fighting against that. And Jezal's constantly struggling against the environment that he's in, the systematic nature that he's in. But he's so kind of, I would say, maybe sweet's not the right word, but he's sensitive and he's genuinely like he often chooses to be kind, and that can be part through his ignorance, but it's also part of just his more sensitive nature. It's just this environment gets him down every time. And as we go through this and we see all these elements of character growth, like you'll see how they get just flipped on their heads and stomped on in many cases because of just this universe of the First Law and characters like Baez that won't let him have those moments because it's not, his place. It's not what they need from Jezal. So I just love all of that. And that gets us to, like, let's just go through the contest really quickly because we all know that Jezal wins, and I love that. But I love the moment where he wins through magic. Like Baez uses magic to make Jezal win, unbeknownst to Jezal. So when Baez is like, "Congratulations, Jezal," like Jezal's like, "Ew, who is this guy? Get him away from me! Like I'm busy celebrating my victory."
I just earned my victory. Who's this guy?
Which is so classic Jezal. He has no idea what's going on at any point. Like people are playing chess like 3 levels above where he's at, and he's just like, I just won, you crazy old man.
I just won this game of checkers.
Yeah, exactly. Like, get away from me. And Baez is just like smiling contently to himself, and yeah, I just love those moments, and it's all a part of like the payoff of Jezal's character arc too, and we're just seeing exactly how far removed Jezal is from the scheming of this society, and it's working for him now, but it's the tragic arc of his character that it gets, like, when he does grow as a person and he's ready to do good things, he's like, the environment will not let him. Yeah, he's ill-equipped. And before we get there, we need to go through before they're hanged. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and just another note on the winning the contest. It's, again, Abercrombie understands his characters so well that what he's trying to just bang the drum for over and over again with Jezal in the Blade itself is this guy over and over again gets things he does not actually earn or deserve. And even when he trains really hard for this contest, someone was training much harder in Bremerdan Gorst. And Gorst had a lot of natural ability, I think, too, his size and all this kind of stuff, but he was training harder for longer, and he should have won.
Yeah, he developed a different style of sword fighting where he had heavier swords and was just going to use his blunt force to break through any of Jezal's training, So it would have won, and everyone saw it as the case, but Jezal came through, whether it's through his privilege or what have you, the blessings of Baez. He was, which is a great phrase. But
what we know it wasn't through was Jezal's skill alone, which there was a lot of, but not as much as Gorst. And I think that's the key, is kind of thinking, like, again, a guy gets a great thing he doesn't deserve, but from Jezal's perspective, what is that like? He has no reason to believe. Like, he doesn't know magic exists. He just thinks, like, wow, I got this extra vigor and I won. So, of course, he's sitting there. We as the readers know, like, dude, you didn't earn that. But he doesn't. So why would he question it? So I don't know. That's my, like, defense of Jezal again. Kind of, like, he's a narcissist, but the world treats him in a way where why would he not be?
So well said. And it's not until he gets out of that world and travels in the Fellowship of the Seed, as we like to call it, that he starts to kind of figure out his own wants and desires and identity a little bit. And that happens in Before They're Hanged. There's not like a whole lot of Jezal going on here. There's really just that, what we call the Fellowship of the Seed journey, in which Baez is lecturing Jezal the whole way on history and what makes a good ruler and how to rule. And Jezal's like bored and frustrated and confused as to why this guy's talking to him and all that. And that's really funny. They bounce around between Jezal, Logan, Pharaoh a lot just to play off of each other, like committing to their perspectives where they don't really understand each other and they all kind of look silly, but then in their own heads they have like these very serious plans. And I really just liked how Logan kind of took Jezal under his wing a little bit and kind of shared some philosophy with Jezal. And it was interesting to see what of that, if anything, took, and then how long it lasted by the time they got back in Last Argument of Kings.
Yeah, well, I think I would say, Charles, that Jezal goes through a ton of growth in Before They Are Hanged.
Yes.
And if the story ended after Before They Are Hanged, I think a lot of people would be feeling satisfied with Jezal's arc as someone who they maybe would be kind of confused why the story ended when there was a lot more to tell.
Right.
But they'd say, wow, like Jezal's arc really believably went from this very privileged person who had to then confront the real world, who then learned a lot of lessons, and we'd probably think, wow, he's going to go back, he's going to be with Artie, who can be honest with him, and like we're ready for all that. And I guess it's probably good for us to talk a little bit in more detail about some of these events that happened that helped him get to that place, like taking that mace to the chin. This is probably called taking it on the chin. But I'll say, to frame these conversations of Jezal and Before They're Hanged, I'm going to make the case that Jezal went through the amount of character growth that we would be hoping for out of a series between the Blade itself at the beginning and the end of Before They're Hanged. And a lot of the reason people are dissatisfied with Jezal's arc in some ways is because then Last Argument backtracks, of course, deliberately and intentionally, but in a way where, like, I think Jezal went through so much character growth. It's just that he undid it later that has people kind of upset with him. But we'll get into the nitty-gritty here.
Exactly. And one of the things that I love about these Before They're Hanged moments, you really get to see how, the Union was basically like a bubble. And when you took Jezal, perhaps the most like ignorant, naive, inexperienced person, and you just put him out there in the same situation as Logan Ninefingers, who's like lived out in the wild for a long time, very realistic about many things. And then you have Jezal, who's I don't think ever been realistic, and you put them in the same right. You put them in the same level. Jezal went in with these social constructs of like, oh, he's a barbarian, and like, don't get too close to me, like all these other things. But then I love these moments where like it's raining and Jezal's miserable in his clothes, and like his clothes are chafing and they stay wet forever. And then Logan's like has taken his shirt off and is like embracing the rain, and Jezal's looking at him like he's crazy. But meanwhile, Jezal's uncomfortable for days and days, and he feels hunger for the first time. He starts to eat some of the traveling food that he was kind of turning away for a little while. He starts to actually break down some of these social constructs and sees these people more as his comrades. And he actually even appreciates and gains respect for Logan and Pharaoh. And there's even these moments towards the end where he's like, perhaps I've not been such a good person. And he makes all these promises to himself, like, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to propose to Artie, like all of these things. And you're like, wow, Jezal, it's amazing what taking you out of this environment can do. And also there's the metaphor of his chin, right? Where there's this line in The Blade itself where he's like, he wiped his face, and then his favorite part of the day, gazed at himself in the looking glass. And then there's these lines where he doesn't think he's ever seen a more perfect chin, all those lines like that. And then we know in Before They're Hanged, one of Jezal's highlights is that he gets a mace to the face and it like wrecks his chin. It's a very humbling experience for Jezal. I don't think any character gets more humbled than Jezal in Before They're Hanged in this whole trilogy. He definitely has this he has to almost be forced to face humility when he's like blubbering in pain and he loses his perfect chin. It was such a great payoff for all those chin comments we got in Blade itself. It's like, now let me put this guy through the ringer. And I think a lot of people kind of appreciated seeing this like whiny, privileged, annoying person get his due. I think a lot of people see it that way. And it's just another brilliant layer in his character arc.
Yeah, well said, Charles. And you say no character got humbled more than Jezal. I would say no one had more room for humbling than Jezal had in the entire series.
True.
So, yeah, if if Logan took a mace to the face, that wouldn't make a lot of change in his life.
Right.
He's taken a lot of wounds of that nature, and in fact, he's kind of this guidance through the process for Jezal in a lot of ways, and not just for when Jezal's recovering from getting hit by the mace, but throughout, as you were touching on before they're hanged, is that moment in the rain that you mentioned is one that if you didn't bring it up, I was going to, and it's basically like Jezal's just chafing everywhere. He's walking in the rain. He's like, his like nipples are chafing and all this kind of stuff, and he's just in outright pain. And Logan, being realistic about these things and having a lot of this experience, he just takes off his shirt, and it's hard for Jezal to look on and say like, wait, I am chafing all over. If I took off my shirt, that would stop. And in a lot of ways, it's like when Jezal's such a product of his environment, as we've said. And when the environment changes, and he's out there, speaking of environment, he's out there in the rain, and he's out there in the wilderness, and there's not all these societal structures. It gives him the chance to just like accept things for how they are, and I think he does take off his shirt, if I'm remembering correctly, and
well,
it helps.
Maybe eventually, but what I do remember about that scene is he looks at Logan with his shirt off, embracing the rain, like he's a crazy person.
And he thinks Logan, yes. Well, he's like, what a barbarian, like all this kind of stuff. Like, how could he do that? But I do think he eventually comes around. Correct. You can shoot us a tweet if.
Right. I would not be surprised if that was the case, but certainly at the beginning, he's like, "Look at this guy. He's crazy. He took his shirt off. Is he mad? Like that's not proper or whatever. All these other things." But it was a great highlight of exactly how much Jezal had to learn about, what it's like traveling out in the world. And I love all these lessons too that Logan is sneaking in, like, oh, leave the violence to people who aren't smart enough to avoid it. Oh, like what matters is you go back and just live the life you want to live with the people that you love, and like leave the squabbling to the others. Like the best thing you can do is to just live this life of obscurity and peace. That's kind of a lot of the advice that Logan is seeping into Jezal, and Jezal's takeaway is like, yeah, I just want to go back, and I will, like, the minute I see Artie, I'm gonna lay myself down and propose to her because I love her so much. Anything to get out of this rain and back into her arms, like that kind of thing. And so all these lessons are being learned and taught, and then it's up to last argument of kings to determine like exactly how far that character growth is going to go or last or what have you. But I think it's interesting that Logan's getting through to Jezal in this way, and Logan's a great teacher in a lot of ways, but we had our whole conversation about ultimately what Logan does with his own advice, but it's good advice nonetheless. And Jezal was a good ear to kind of absorb it. And we've all been in those situations where it's like, man, if I could just get out of here, like I would go home and like, whatever, like hug my family or whatever. So Jezal's going through those moments right now. And that's what his arc is kind of committed to and before they're hanged. And I just love it. Like you said, a lot of character growth happening, all for the better. And then it's like, okay, how does he, when he gets back into reality, how does that stand up in the real world? Which I think is a big thesis in Abercrombie's work here in the First Law.
Yeah, well said, Charles. And I'll grab one of these moments of Jezal in the rain, and I'm not seeing him taking off his shirt, so I could be wrong about that. But there's this line: Jezal began to perceive dimly that he had until now had rather an easy life. I love the word dimly, making its way.
He had rather an easy life. Also, that commitment to his, to his perspective in the narration for his chapters is what makes him so good.
Exactly. Yeah, we're so tight to Jezal's perspective that it's like, if you think of it from this lens of like interacting with Jezal directly, it's almost super frustrating because it's like, dude, really? Rather an easy life? Like, you're dimly getting this? But if you think of it from the perspective of like Abercrombie and his commitment to his characters and being so tight to their perspective, that's when I think Jezal really starts to shine. Because it's like, dude, like, I love that Abercrombie decided to say it this way. Like, he decided to say dimly because it's like, dude, of course, just this is Jezal trying to overcome. I mean, how old is he at this point? He's probably like in his early 20s or something,
Probably.
would be my guess. I'm not sure if it's ever established, but that's how I think of him. If you know the answer, let us know. And then, yeah, it's that, of course, Jezal's only barely starting to come into touch with this idea. He's overcoming, let's say, like 2 decades or so of his privilege. And it's, it goes on to say, like, he talking about times where he was moaning about having to lower himself to play cards with Lieutenant Brent, or how sausages were always a touch overdone in the morning. It's like those kind of things are what he's having to face. And finally, he's starting to realize it. And that's just one of the many moments we get here as Jezal starts to see someone like Logan, who in the meantime has a line that says, he says, oh God, it's, you call this rain, I think. I'm trying to find it where, oh yeah, it's like, Jezal, he says something I can't say on our clean podcast here, but I'll paraphrase. He says, F them then, and this rain too. And the next line is, you call this rain? Nine Fingers rode past him, a big smile spread across his ugly lump of a face. And again, there's that, like, the way the prose speaks from Jezal's perspective is he just sees, like, this, he can't see past the fact that he thinks Logan is ugly to see the wisdom that Logan has yet. But he really does start to get there over time as Logan tells him over and over again these lessons.
That's so well said. And that's what, that's how Abercrombie just stands out for us. We always say, oh, great character work and all those other things. And these quotes kind of really highlight that. Like, his commitment to the voice of each character in the narration of the POV chapter is so great. All these subtle things, like even just describing Logan's face as lumpy and ugly, or even just saying like, oh, he might have had a slightly easy life. It's like he's not willing to admit that much. Like, he's still, like, these key words just make this character absolutely pop to life. And it's so much fun to dissect and look back on and see where it ends up, because of how so much of the story is about character growth and how much work is put into it, and then how much it ultimately doesn't matter.
Lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly. That's the genius of it. And no one highlights that more than Jezal, who's kind of like the tragic version, where he has no control, but he went through the best character growth. He did what we want a hero to do in a lot of ways, is gain compassion and power and humility and all these things. And then he's the one that gets dunked on by Baez and forced into this puppet king situation where he cannot live the life he wants and cannot have the life that he wants to have, even though he's ready. Like, he may even be a good king now. He's talking about democracy and all these other things, but it does not matter because Baez is calling the shots. And all of that compassion is learned here and Before They're Hanged. And it's brilliant as well, all I can say. And that's why Jezal stands out for me. Like, yeah, he doesn't get any great one-liners. He has a lot of characteristics about him that you can instinctively be like, oh, this guy's a privileged and annoying. But when you look at the character work and the growth that he goes through and the way it's treated and the subtlety of it, it's up there with Kalakta and Logan and all the others. It's just as brilliant. It's just flipped on itself.
Exactly, Charles. And that's a kind of conversation when we were preparing for this episode. I know you mentioned that you were hoping like I would come in with some quotes, and I hope I'm doing it so far. And I said to you, like, it's interesting because I don't think of Jezal as particularly quotable, because usually it's like when we're grabbing quotes, it's like someone like Glocta, right? If you want Glocta quotes, they're going to be either his like internal monologue or his dialogue or something like that, because he has all these epic lines that come from him directly as a character.
Exactly.
But I said to you in that text exchange, I was like, I don't know if Jezal's particularly quotable, but then I was thinking about it and I was like, well, like the best quotes for Jezal will probably be in the prose, because it's the way that the prose, by being so tied to Jezal's narcissistic and ridiculously privileged perspective, gets to poke fun at him to the reader. And in this way that is almost like, at first when Jezal is like needs to like, dude, like Blade itself like needs to learn these lessons.
Yeah.
It's funny and we get to be like, this guy. But then it gets to the point then where there's almost this transition, as we'll continue to move through this, where it almost starts to become sad, where he's like helpless and trying so hard in Abercrombie's to like resist Abercrombie's grimdark world around him. And we've mentioned that we think Glocta is the character most aware of the not that he's in a novel, but not that he knows he's in a novel, but he is most aware of the tone of the world that he's in, and we'll almost say like the most aware that he's in a grimdark novel.
Yeah.
And I think that in contrast to Glocta, Jezal is the least aware
Definitely.
of the kind of novel that he is in. And that's why the novel gets to, in the prose, make fun of him, but then also the novel gets to like really beat him down to the point where it's tragic, like you said, Charles, and I feel for him, and we're starting to move toward that point.
Exactly. One of the things now that we're going into Last Argument of Kings that I want to keep in perspective is, one, like very touching on this Artie relationship, but two, this idea of Jezal's ending, and it's like, does he get what he deserves? Does he have a choice? Is it tragic? Like those kind of things. And you touched on it really well, where I do think it's absolutely tragic. The guy did everything a hero in a fantasy novel is supposed to do, and he ends
then there was another book.
Yeah. short of the most, short of being one of these characters that gets killed, he has one of the most, disappointing outcomes for any of these characters, and we can get into that. But it all starts with, remember, at the end of before they're hanged, Jezal's learning all these lessons, and he's like, oh, the first thing I'm going to do when I get back is I'm going to profess my love to Artie, and that's what I want to do, and that's all like I can think about, and that's what got him through his recovery and through all the horrible experiences, because I would say that journey was harder for him than anyone else who was on that trip, because they were all experienced travelers except for him. So he overcame.
Oh, maybe. Well, never mind about Kwai. Because Kwai was already out of it.
Kwai was already.
That wasn't really Kwai.
Yeah.
But if you consider what happened beforehand.
Kwai is a good one as well. But we kind of overlook Kwai, which is
take him over by then.
We overlook him, which is another brilliant twist by Abercrombie. We overlook him because he's Ptolemy, but that was an interesting development. But yeah, of all like the POV characters, he definitely went through, he had the hardest go of it and came out with the most growth from it. So that plops us right into Last Argument of Kings. He gets back to Adua. There's these moments where Baez is building up his legendary status. Like Jezal sees a beggar getting some harassment from some guards, and he interferes, which is something he's like, why am I even doing this? I'm so surprised. He's learned all these things from being outside, for like, he's not back for 2 seconds before he sees something that normally he probably would have walked past or even agreed with, but now he's defending a beggar. And he didn't do too, he put one guy down and the other guy left. But Baez was loudly proclaiming, like, Jezal, like, defender of the common people, the common man.
Winner of the contest.
Winner of the contest. And everyone's kind of looking like, oh, that's interesting. So I love this thread of Baez building up Jezal, by the way. It's so funny. Like in the second read where, he gets hit in the chin and Baez is like, it will do. We can work with this. And you're like, what is he talking about? But then you're like, oh, yeah, this is so funny. How Baez is just like looking at Jezal like a prized horse or something.
Here's that quote, Charles, because I highlighted that one when I read it. From Baez after he's looking at Jezal's new face. He says, yes, all in all, I think it will serve.
It will serve,
and that it will serve. And you can take that. So this is what's fun about these character profiles is we can't die. That's before they're hanged.
Right.
And because we don't do spoilers for the full series when we're doing the before they're hanged discussion, you can't dive into the potential double meaning of Baez, who thinks of people like, I like to say, he thinks of them as cattle on a good day and ants on a bad day.
Yeah.
And he's looking at Jezal, who's his like prized pig, for lack of a better way of putting it, that he's gonna send to the he's gonna put up in the king's chair, his prized puppet maybe. And he's saying it will serve. So that could mean Jezal's face, but it's also thinking about it kind of as like, to Baez, Jezal isn't it. So he's almost looking at, because Jezal's so much less than him in his way he views himself as a mage or magi, and he looks at then Jezal is just this mere human ant basically, and he's like, yeah, it will serve, like it will do, but it will also serve the purposes of Baez, and it being Jezal will serve the purposes of Baez.
Right. It reminds me of when someone's trying to buy like a prized cow or a horse, and they're like checking the teeth and everything of the animal. Like Baez is essentially doing that to Jezal while Jezal's like writhing in pain from the injury. He's like holding up his chin, looking at him, like looking at the different angles. He's like, okay, we're still good. This will serve, and we can actually make this work. It's like he's the battle-hardened like hero the city deserves. And it's like you said, this is why almost like we felt like we had to do these character episodes, because we wanted to talk about all of these moments, and to try and do it all within this last argument of Kings discussion that would have
been before they're hanged, and
right, but then to have
we couldn't have had the spoiler.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is to have all of these conversations, it's like, and hey, remember in Before They're Hanged when he said that? Isn't that crazy that now we're here? It's like we can't have that for every single character. Like it would be hours and hours long. It was already a two-parter, the last argument of Kings, rightfully deserved. But that's where we are, and that's what all these Jezal moments are so fantastic, and that one of the chin and the beggars and the guards and all of the history, and like, oh, this guy was a great ruler, but he didn't understand that you need to balance compassion with a like brute strength every once in a while. You need to prove your strength, and like don't be powers won through action, like all of these other things. He's like trying to get Jezal to get these ideas in his head, and it's all pays off here. But first, before Jezal gets voted king, he does get back with Artie, but it's not the experience that he romanticized in his head. I believe she was drunk at the time, and their interaction their romantic encounter, I'll say, was very awkward and rough in some ways. Like Artie was kind of out of it. It was not what you would expect when you're rushing back into a lover's arms. It was the exact opposite. It was very unromantic and awkward, but they do end up pursuing a relationship out of it. But this is like the early seeds of Jezal kind of unlearning some of his lessons. It starts with some of these like, oh, this wasn't as built up in my head as I thought it was going to be. And oh, like now that I'm back, like he's like getting back more into business as usual kind of stuff. And that's where these moments with Artie happen.
Yeah, and Artie's a real person with her, well, not in the real world, but...
She's not real, you know that, right, Dylan?
I'm vaguely... it's like the Jezal, I'm dimly aware that these characters we talk about aren't real people. Yeah. But I think that it's... as a character in the First Law world, Artie is to be taken as a real person with her own issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of why, like, nothing bows down to character in a First Law novel. Let me rephrase that. Everything bows down to character in a First Law novel. Nothing supersedes characters and their arcs. And this is one of those moments where, like, you almost feel like the story was setting itself up for this, like, rush back into your lover's arms and everyone's come to have it together. But it's like, then Artie, because she's got all these things that she's trying to work out from her own experiences as a child and with Column, with her father, with Column West as well, like, all these things, she's not herself ready for this rush into your lover's arms moment, and she like bites his lip and he's bleeding, I think, if I'm remembering all this correctly. And
right.
It's weird, and it's not all the, Jezal comes back and the story isn't panning out the way that he has hoped for and kind of built it up in his head, because these are, like, you have to be realistic about these things. Artie was not there yet. And that being said, the two of them do, like you said, pursue this relationship, and though there are some bumps in the road, they're close enough to ready where it looks like maybe it's going to go okay despite their issues.
Right, and we remember Logan's advice, right? Like, oh, find someone you love, stay with them, leave the fighting to someone else. And Jezal was all in on that as he was bandaged up in the wagon, in the middle of the desert, right?
Yeah.
And in the waste. And now that he's back, he's starting to take that advice. I do like Jezal and Artie's relationship. They seem to really be a genuinely good couple in a decent amount of ways. Like, they are having a good time together. They're exchanging quips and jabs, and they seem to be compatible. But we get this moment that I love, and it's almost like, it's the tragedy of Jezal's character is, they're in bed together, and they get a knock on the door, and literally he's just on the other side of the door with Artie waiting for him. And they're like, it's Farouz, right? He's like, Jezal, we're promoting you to colonel, and we need you to go and quell a peasant revolt right now. And Jezal, after all of Logan's advice and after what he told himself over and over again, recovering in that wagon, the second someone dangles a superficial promotion in his face, he's like, I deserve to be colonel. It's like, to be colonel, you have to, like, serve in the army and actually go to war and, like, have years of experience and have all these connections. But you just get it, and only Jezal could be offered colonel and feel like he deserved it and accept it without any questions, and that's what has been built up for Jezal this whole time. He's like, yeah, I deserve this. It's about time. Wow, Colonel, this is fantastic. Like, my career is taking off as it should, all these other things. And he just goes. He doesn't take his own advice. He doesn't take Logan's advice. He doesn't do what he swore up and down he was going to do when he was traveling. And that's because they dangled a little carrot in front of him, and you can see in the narration, he slowly starts to talk himself out of all the lessons that he's learned. It's so well written in the narration, and it's such a great scene, and it's the first warning sign that we get from Jezal in Last Argument of Kings that, hey, he might not learn all of these lessons. They might not stick in his brain after all, and that's calculated by bias.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. I mean, you can take the kid out of the Agrion, but you can't take the Agrion out of the kid.
Well said.
And that's the thing about Jezal is and you especially can't take the Agrion out of the kid when you put him back in the Agrion.
Yes.
And it's like, if you remove Jezal permanently from this environment of the Agrion and what everyone's telling him in it and what purposes everyone needs him to serve within it, then sure, maybe he could have sustained a lot of this growth. But it's basically, I don't know how long they were on the Fellowship of the Seed journey, but I can be very confident in it was only a small fraction of time compared to the many years of Jezal's life prior to that short experience. So it makes sense why Jezal is slipping into these old habits, because he's back in the same place with the same people to start treating him in the same way they used to. And
Right.
he doesn't have it in him really to resist that, and it's sad to see
And
that
it just
happen.
snowballs. He goes from colonel to overthrowing the tanner with no problems with Baez, and that did not bring up any warning signs in Jezal's head. He goes back after dealing with the tanner back to Adua, and they have like a welcome procession, and he's like, I deserve this. This is great. Like, it's about time people started recognizing my potential and all these other things. And you're like, what are you doing? And then it even gets to the point where he's elected king. And it's like, oh, you're
Yeah.
the illegitimate son of the king. And we vote for you. And he's like, this is great. I can't believe it. I'm the king now.
His first reaction is like, he's like paling and freaking out at this idea of like, he doesn't really want to be. He starts to slowly.
Right. He's like
wait,
slowly, systematically unlearning the lessons.
Exactly.
And it's a slow process. And he's like talking himself out of his lessons,
Yeah. And I think that's something we got to give Jezal credit for, that he's coming into these moments at least a little like, wait, like, no, something's wrong here. But then the world starts treating him in all of these ways. Like, he is a great hero who negotiated with the tanner in such an amazing fashion, and then he is the illegitimate son of a king, and that makes him a king now.
And he went on all these brave adventures.
Like, yes. And he did, he took a mace to the face. Like, he went through a lot of hardship, and was he the hero of that journey? No, but he went
Did that
through
journey
a lot of hard
accomplish
times.
anything? No.
That's fair. And it's like Jezal, again, is just reacting to what the world is telling him about himself. And he at least has the decency in Last Argument of Kings to feel like there's something off. But when over and over again the messages he's being sent are he's all these things, what incentive is there for him to question it?
Yeah, old habits die hard for certain. And all this sense of entitlement and the idea of being a noble in this society just kind of it helps Jezal, even though he's unsure and cautious, it helps him buy into it. And that's all he needs to do to begin this arc of tragedy, is like buy into the fact that he's even somewhat earned any of this. Like this is, again, when we talked about the contest, it's like this idea of earning something through privilege alone and not through hard work. I mean, the guy becomes king, it's like king of the union. He certainly did not deserve it, but Baez's narrative put him there, and you could argue it's his privilege that puts him there in conjunction with Baez's puppetry. And Jezal still, when he's king, is like, oh, there's so many things I want to do now. And he's starting to realize that his power is an illusion. He's ignored by the close council. He's forced to sit through tedious audiences. Baez is constantly, it's funny to say this, interfering. And that's such a great way the narration works, where Jezal's like, why is Baez getting in the way of me being king? It's like, oh, Jezal, you have no idea what's going on. Like, you're getting in the way of Baez running the world. You're such a small piece in that. And his narrative is constantly describing how people are getting in his way and not listening. But it's like, dude, you're not getting the full picture here. And, he gets to do his few moments of good. He promotes Colin West to Lord Marshal, and that was a fun moment. But for the most part, he's getting told what to do. And, we were talking about Artie and Jezal, but I think another really interesting relationship now is Jezal and Princess Therese of Talons, where the roles get kind of flipped, because Princess Therese proves to be unhappy and resents him. Why? Because of his illegitimate birth, and Jezal's trying to process that. It's like, oh, she's a princess. She's, really good looking, and she's of high birth, and like, this is going to be so great and awesome. And then she's like, don't touch me. Get away from me. Like, I don't like you. You're an illegitimate, like, your lineage is illegitimate. Like, I don't want anything to do with you outside of our public interactions. And Jezal's like, what? It's such a great flip to the Artie arc, which he, of course, had to break up with Artie.
Yeah. And speaking of his relationship with Therese, there's a chapter in Last Argument of Kings called The Perfect Couple, and which we learn is ironically named. And
can you expect any less
reflecting
from Joe Abercrombie? If you read a title called The Perfect Couple, you should be very suspicious. You'd be like, oh, what kind of scathing commentary is Abercrombie going to have on relationships now?
Exactly. Oh, God. Every conversation... Abercrombie is so amazing, dude. It's so good. But in this chapter, there's Jezal's basically reflecting on that he doesn't really remember accepting a proposal from in any way. Like he's just kind of he's just ready for his wedding. And there's this line: since his enthronement, he had drifted helplessly through one incomprehensible event after another, like a man shipwrecked and struggling to keep his head above water, out of sight of land, dragged who knew where by unseen, irresistible currents, but considerably better dressed. He was, and this is the big one, he was gradually starting to realize that the more powerful a man became, the fewer choices he really had. So let's bring that one into this no choice at all idea that you had for an episode titled Charles, which is Jezal had far more choices when he was just what's he start?
Captain?
Captain. Yeah, I think you're right there, Charles. Nice.
Yeah, thank you.
So when he's just a captain at the start, he's able to make all these choices for what he wants to do with his life. He could have theoretically been with Artie in that case. It would have been a scandal, but that's that. Like right. No one would have actually done anything to stop it. But now that he's so close to, he calls it irresistible currents, he's soon going to learn that those irresistible currents are just a very tight puppet string, because he's gotten so close to Baez himself wielding those strings. And he's so close at this point, he's too high up in that puppeteer chain of strings that he now does not have any sense of control without defying Baez. And we know we'll get to the moment where Baez tells him exactly what will happen if he defies him. And it's kind of like Jezal, by the time he's learned enough to realize the freedom that he once had, he no longer has that freedom. And that's kind of the irony of Jezal's arc, I think.
Yeah, there was a great quote towards the end where he basically explicitly says that too. He's like, man, I had more freedom as a captain than I did as a king. Yep. He reflects on that. And that's such an important part of Jezal's arc, is that he realizes that, but it's too late. He's let these carrots dangled in front of him lead him to this situation that is now unavoidable. He's too far under the unrelenting current of Baez's games, and he's stuck in it now, and there's not much he can do. And that is such a great part, and it's built on top of that with him being unaware of everything that was happening is another piece to it that I want to make sure we revisit, is that he, even to the end, was pushing on Baez and pushing on the close council and thinking that he was a king and thinking that he was changed and that he was going to enact democracy and that he was going to have a meaningful relationship with Therese and all of these other things. And it just was never the case. And he doesn't learn that until the very, very end of his last POV chapter. He's looking out at Baez leaving, and he's like, I am so screwed. This is the end for me. And it's tragic, because he genuinely went through some real growth, but because of the nature in which he was raised and the systematic puppeteering of Baez throughout his whole life, he was never, and just his ignorance to like the greater game being played here, that he was just taken advantage of essentially to the very end, and he didn't even realize it until Baez like explicitly like squished his guts and told him like you do what I say, you have no real power and you don't mean anything. And to me that's tragic, even though yes, a lot of Jezal's time we spent with him, he was doing like unsavory, like privileged, annoying things. His whole environment was working against him, and then ultimately when he does learn his lessons, which is not an easy thing to do, but he somehow manages to do it, it's rendered like inactionable because he's in this position where he's the puppet king for Baez and for Glokta. So it's, for me, I always looked at this like, man, Jezal's so tragic. Like I feel bad for him. Like I get a lot of people don't like him, especially from the Blade itself. There's not a lot to like about the Blade itself version of Jezal, but Jezal the King at the end of Last Argument of Kings is someone who's learned his lessons and can't do anything about it. And it's that bitter like irony that Abercrombie has used to subvert the idea of character growth in a fantasy novel. You know, usually the character learns their lessons and learns to like love and to trust, and then ends up in their happily ever after scenario. And he learns those things, but it doesn't matter because reality has pulled him away. And that is the Jezal character arc. To me, it's tragic.
For sure. And he doesn't even get to leave the story with that sense of having been as privileged or like as of noble birth as he thought he was too, because even as he's getting built up all this way of like, okay, well, Jezal, your environment and everyone is telling you that you are actually a king, like you deserve this, Jezal. And he's like, yeah, well, maybe I do deserve this now that I think about it. I was born to a king. He doesn't even get to keep that because Baez tells him, no, you were just some nobody's bastard, not a king's bastard. And I just found you, and among all these other people who could have been the person that I elevate to king because I need them to sit there and look like a king while I run everything, like you're just one of them.
Yes.
And it could have been anyone else.
Yes.
And
Jezal's entire foundation gets brought down in that scene where even he was a noble or a legitimate king. It's like, no, I purchased you from a commoner and I planted you like a seed, and I planted a whole bunch of seeds, and you just happened to be the one that I chose, and don't think you were ever the only one. Like, don't think you can't be replaced. You are literally nothing unless I say that you are. And Jezal's whole world at that point gets rocked. And then he's left like sniveling like a child because Baez basically used the power against him and like gave him a lot of pain to help him learn that lesson quickly, which was very effective. And then he is resigned. He now finally understands the role that he plays in this, and it's too late. He's the puppet king at best, and he's watching Glokta marry Artie, the only woman he's ever loved. Yeah. It's tragic.
While being the person who runs his kingdom, like, more directly than Baez.
And then anyone he will ever try to interact with will be like, you're the king, you must be so happy, and like, how could you ever feel bad as the king? You know, he's got no one to commiserate with. He's trapped.
Yeah. And this is what's so bitter about, I almost said bittersweet, but there's nothing sweet about it. No. Like, this is what's so bitter about the Jezal arc is, had he not gone through all of that character growth, especially before they're hanged, to get to this point, he could have been probably deeply satisfied with a life as a king that is told by everyone how amazing he is and how he's a king.
Yes.
And doesn't actually get to or have to, is the way he would have thought about it, think for himself or do anything or try to help anyone. And that's why this is so tragic to me, Charles. It's like he did all of this growth, and then he's punished for that growth by this sense of dissatisfaction that comes with having become a better person
man, that's so
and being aware of the things that are wrong about being a king that everyone tells is great while actually having no true power or responsibility.
That's so true. That tragic irony rings true. Like if you took Act 1, Scene 1, Jezal, and made him king, but says, hey, look, Bias and Glock are going to tell you what to do, but you're king. Isn't that great? He'd be like, yeah, that is great. I deserve this. Isn't this fantastic? And you'd have a better go of it than, than Last Argument of Kings Jezal that's learned all his lessons. It's like learning these lessons makes the experience even worse. And that's what, earns Abercrombie this grimdark title. It's like, I learned all my lessons. I understand what's happening now. I understand, but it's through knowing that makes your experience and your position even more tragic. It's like you did all the good things and you're being punished for it right now.
Yeah.
So brutal.
Right. And that's why Jezal gets one of the most tragic and sad endings for him. It's like, dude, you're just in the wrong book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, man. You tried, you had some chances, you made some mistakes for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But, heroes make mistakes in all sorts of books. And we're reading Wheel of Time now. I'd say the heroes make mistakes.
Yeah.
I don't know where it will go. But, because I'm still
Jezal's
first-time reader.
mistakes come from, like, an innocence almost, where it's like he didn't know any
naivety.
better. And naivete, that's better. Where it's like, he just didn't, he was put in an environment where he was doomed to fail. And that's, he's just one of the many whims of Baez, which is crazy to think about. And, like, Baez doesn't realize, well, he doesn't care anyway, that he's playing with human lives, because to him, he realizes, but that's like his perspective is
irrelevant to him.
Yeah, it's irrelevant. So, but Jezal has to live in the wake of the consequences of Baez's decisions, and Baez doesn't care about Jezal's experience at all. He doesn't care if Jezal's happy or like is fulfilled. He just cares that he does what he tells him to do, and those few moments that he actually needs him. It's like, my attention's going elsewhere, but I expect you to do everything. It's like he doesn't even care enough to see that he's doing what he wants him to do. He's like, I'm leaving, but this is all the stuff you're going to do. It's so brutal.
And some credit to Jezal and his resilience, where he goes through all of it. And the last time I think we see him in the First Law Trilogy is he's asking Glokta if he can figure out a way to, well, first he suggests a tax on the banks.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Which just goes,
what's next? Have people vote? Give me a break.
Well, and what bank is premier among all the banks? It's Valiant and Bulk, which is run by Baez. And Jezal, literally the worst thing you could do to defy Baez is to tax the banks.
It again highlights how little he understands about the game that's being played, where his first thing is to tax the banks, and Glokta's like, oh, you sweet summer child.
Yes, exactly.
That's a horrible idea.
Yeah, and credit to Glokta for actually like being somewhat gentle to Jezal in this moment. But yeah, he's asking, maybe we could tax these rich banks. Maybe we could pay for a new hospital near the docks and surgeons and help these suffering people. It's like, dude, Jezal, for everything he's been through, to end up in this situation with his worldview shattered, to be rendered powerless, he still wants to do something.
The risk he's taking by expressing that to Glokta, too. He's under the thumb of Baez. There's no worse person you could cross, and Jezal realizes this at this point, right? He's seen Baez turn people to bloody mist. He's been traumatized from Baez multiple times, and he's still like, hey, Glokta, maybe while he's gone we can like build a hospital. It's like, oh man, Jezal, you're so brave, but also so not ready for this.
Yeah, still in the wrong book. It's like Glokta almost gets as Abercrombie character arcs go, like a happy ending. I don't want to say happy, but you know what I'm saying. It's like
Yeah.
Galacta had some things he would have wanted getting at the start, probably, which is like some reason to live, like some sort of greater power to actually do things. And he ends up married to Artie, who sincerely like is caring for him and wants to be a part of this relationship and do
Hmm.
right by all this, and like that's a genuine relationship by the end here.
Yes.
And he ends up with as much power as someone not named Baez or Kalul can have.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot to be said for, look, is Glocta happy by the end of it? Who's happy in the First Law world with any sense of what's going on around them? But it's like he gets something of a relatively like nice ending for him and gets some of the things he would have wanted at the start. And I think he has a reason to live by the end of it. And he didn't at the start. And it's like that's because Glocta is in the right book for someone like him. And he's such a good fit for this grimdark world. And Jezal, even till the bitter end, and bitter in every sense of that word, like, well, maybe not the like taste of it, but in the bitter end is still, he's still in the wrong book for him, and he gets this very tragic
So
ending.
true. And in the
It's so
meta
tough.
of all of this too, Galacta tortures people mercilessly. Logan kills people mercifully. What's the worst crime Jezal's ever committed? And thinking about his chin and like
Yeah.
stringing Artie along, like is that his worst crimes? Yet he is by far the least. In our Twitter polls, he couldn't even beat Dogman, who had way less screen time. I love Dogman, don't get me wrong, but he almost feels like not as big of a feature as Jezal. And that's a lot because we are so focused on these elements of a human being that we don't like, that Jezal embodies, and the narrative is so focused on that. But when you think about it, he was trying. He's just in the wrong book. He's in the wrong book even for people to rally behind him like they do with Logan and Glocta, who have committed much more horrible war crimes than Jezal, but it's just wrong book, man. Sorry. People don't like you.
Tough sitch.
Tough sitch. But I think we did him enough justice today. I don't know how you're feeling, Dylan, but, I was glad we were able to focus a conversation on Jezal, and I hope we didn't do him dirty.
No, I don't think we did him dirty at all. In fact, we've after all of these, we're doing these character profiles because we think every character in the First Law is freaking amazing, basically. All the ones that get time to actually be featured are incredibly compelling characters.
Mm-hmm.
And we used with like Logan, we were like, we gotta give a warning at the end here of like, hey, I know we've been really hard on this character today, but we really think they're a great, compelling character, even if they're not a nice person deep down. And I think we don't have to do that at all.
We have to do the opposite.
Jezal, because it's like, we have to be like, hey, we know you hate Jezal, but but I don't know how
consider
to
his environment. Consider the book he's in, and how ill prepared he was, and how sensitive he is, and how little horrible things he actually ended up doing. It's like we're doing the reverse. We're like arguing why we are kind of nice to him, whereas we're arguing why we're mean to maybe someone like Logan. That's
exactly. And it's like, these are targeting First Law fans, people who've read the full trilogy, and they know. Look, we could give you a podcast where we spend or an episode, maybe not a whole podcast, but we could give you an episode of our podcast where we discuss how Jezal is a narcissist. But I think you probably knew that from the first chapter of the Blade itself, that Jezal is very conceited at the start, and there's all these things to dislike about him, and they're valid reasons to dislike Jezal. And what we hope to spend more time, because it's more interesting to us and we hope more interesting to you too, we want to spend time talking about some of these things about Jezal that don't get as much attention, which is these aspects of how he's truly trying, how he does go through a lot of growth, and he kind of just it's a tough sitch.
Yeah, and I always like to see the First Law as Joe Abercrombie's thesis on the grimdark nature of society, and you take a character like Jezal, who is trying to grow, has the position in which he has grown and come so far, and just certain elements of society take that all away from him or have it rendered meaningless, and that's just another layer of his whole thesis on the grimdark nature of society, where you have someone like Galactus succeeding, someone like Jezal losing everything, and everything in between. So I think it's just more interesting to frame these character profiles in that way of like what is Abercrombie potentially trying to theorize about his society in First Law, that someone like Jezal gets everything taken away from him, gets put in this tragic position. And I think to see him from a bit more sympathetic lens helps to do that.
I agree, Charles. I'm glad we approach this from this way. I feel, even if we're not happy with where Jezal ends up, right. I'm feeling happy with where this episode of Jezal ended up.
Me too. And with all that being said, I think we're ready to get into the outro.
Yeah, let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping.
All
so
right.
Good talking about this awesome character arc.
I know. So, always a good time when we get to talk about the First Law world and Joe Abercrombie's writing. It's always such a privilege. So looking forward to talking more First Law with you in the very near future.
Yep. Always looking forward to talking more First Law with you, Charles. So yep. Next up, it's got to be Pharaoh or West, right?
Right.
I'm thinking it might be Vengeance for Pharaoh.
Vengeance for Pharaoh. I mean, that could be. They were so close in the last poll we did. They were less than 1% or something.
Close.
It was
I think
close.
So. I can't remember.
It was close. So we'll see. But for now, I think we're ready for that outro.
Yeah, let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping.
All right, everybody, thank you for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This has been your co-host, Charles and Dylan, coming at you today with another awesome First Law conversation. If you like what you heard today, if you want to maybe participate in some of these votes, we did Dogman before Jezal because of a Twitter vote, and if you wanted to be part of that action, you can go to us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 on the end, and we are also on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast, and you can always send us an email at the FTF Podcast at gmail.com. Now, Dylan, if they wanted to support the show in a way that was super helpful for us and free for them, and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app. Scroll down past any of those episodes until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the optimal number to click to support the show would be 5 of them. If you have a little bit of extra time and want to go that step further, you can write us a review, and that's super helpful for a podcast like ours. But just listening is more than enough. We appreciate every one of you.
Thank you so much, guys. We appreciate you all just for listening to our First Law ramblings. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.